All right, let's talk about a few rules and just kind of guidelines and a little bit of history of jazz chord notation. So before we jump right into it, for those of you guys who've taken classical theory, you're probably used to looking at something that's a little bit more like this. When you see Roman numerals with these digits 3 and 6, or 6 right afterwards, 6 fours, something like that, this is what's called figured bass. And this is a classical form of chord notation that I want you to just store. There's nothing wrong with learning it. In fact, it's actually kind of interesting how different it is. But I want you to store all that information, if you already have learned about that, in a different part of your brain, because we're going to be using jazz chord notation, which looks something a little bit more like this. And these would be what are called chord symbols. Chord symbols, unlike Roman numerals, which show us the actual chord function, the 1, 6, first inversion. Then we got our 4 chord that's in second inversion, followed by the 4 chord, 2 chord in first inversion, second. Okay, which is a lot of information to kind of like theoretically process. Jazz chord symbols were actually sort of pioneered by jazz musicians just simply to be an easy to read kind of shorthand. That being said, there is no standard set. So, players in the South and players in New York might have developed different ways of writing things. And regionally throughout the United States, of course, and then throughout the world, of course, afterwards. So there's a lot of different interpretations on how to read chord symbols. So for our purposes, I'll be sort of setting strict guidelines on what chord symbols we'll use in our class, but I still want you to be aware of the other ones. So we'll look at a document that'll kind of like help clear up some of that confusion. Anyways, this is a great example of a handwritten lead sheet. Anyone know it? Just by checking out the melody and the changes. That's Georgia right there. But these chord symbols that we're looking at on top of the music, they tell us what the chord structure is, and this is from a lead sheet, which gives us the melody and then the basic chord structure. And that's, most of the time, jazz musicians, that's all they're ever looking at to kind of like figure out a song. No one's giving them a score with exact voicings or anything like that. I want to show one more quick example. This would be a lead sheet. This is in the modern era. This is kind of interesting because the font that jazz musicians kind of prefer is quote unquote a handwritten style. It looks a little bit different than like classical notation, but still retains some of these elements of handwriting. And even in music notation software, jazz musicians historically have been more comfortable reading handwritten charts because that's how most of the music was propagated. So even today, if you're using Finale or Sibelius or MuseScore, for example, when you write a jazz chart and you want jazz musicians to read it, you would input it into the computer, but you would put the score together in handwritten kind of jazz font, which psychologically makes them think that this is a jazz chart that we're playing. If you give it to them in classical font, something feels sort of amiss right off the bat. Anyways, let's go ahead and get right down to it. The really important thing I want to show you guys is this document, the Chord Symbol Standardization Guide. And this is how I want you guys to write chord symbols, and I'll kind of go through some examples. And that is right here. There we go. So I'll tell you what, I'll hang out here too. Hey, there we are. The Chord Symbol Standardization Guide has a lot of really good information. This should be a little bit of review from intervals. 9 equals 2, 11 equals 4, 13 equals 6. But we're just going to jump right down into it to the top of page 3. And this is where you want to get most of your information. So please note that this is separated in 2 columns. The correct spelling, that's what I'll have us using for our class. And the reason I like these particular chord symbols is because they're very clear. No matter how you write them, or if you have terrible handwriting, it's still pretty obvious to other musicians, and I think that's something that's really important. And these variant spellings that are over here on the side would be what you might read in, if you're reading lead sheets or older publications or older lead sheets, for example. There's lots of different ways to say the same bit of sort of abbreviated chord information. So one thing that's really confusing looking at this guide is, think of X, this is like a math problem. X is a variable, and that variable could be your root. So if we're looking at a C major triad, then we would see the letter C and no other information, and that would be telling us that we have a C major triad. Or if it was our variable X, it could be anything. It could be F sharp. And all we saw was the root F sharp. That would indicate that we have an F sharp major triad, or 1, 3, 5 from the key of F sharp major. We're going to start off but just by looking at a couple examples of basic chords, and check out the 7th chord video where I go over the 5 basic chords: major, dominant, minor, half diminished, and diminished. But let's use this as a quick example. Notice in the correct spelling, when you write, let's say C major 7, for example, your root is always going to be kind of a big capital, and when you write major, it'll be with capital letters, and it'll be in this sort of subscript, about half the size of your root. And then the 7th is kind of in this superscript, like above position. So you don't want to write a chord that looks like this. This is really sloppy to look at, a little bit hard to read. You would probably want to write that C major 7 chord more like so. And this is much clearer for jazz musicians to read. Notice the difference. All right. So anyways, with our major 7th chord, whoops, here we are. Check out the variant spellings. This first one, the triangle, is a really common one. And X, or our root, just by itself tells us we have a major triad. And MA7 is telling us one thing, that we have a major 7th on this chord. This is an older fashioned writing style, and if you play Jamie Aebersolds, for example, you're kind of used to reading these. That triangle means major 7th. So here we have a major triad based on our root, let's say it's C, with the major 7th on top. This next chord symbol is pretty redundant because it says major 7th. Well, the triangle can only ever mean one thing, which is major 7th. So it's like major 7th 7, which is kind of confusing. This is more of an old, if you run into a Dixieland book, for example, you might see people writing major 7 just with the number 7. This is with a slash through it. This is terribly confusing, since the 7, when we see 7 after root, usually means dominant chord. So avoid this one at all costs. Whereas this X major 7th chord, MAJ7, well, we're not going to worry about putting a MAJ, or for minor cards, MIN, just MI will do the trick, because it's pretty hard to mistake an A for an I in anyone's handwriting. And that J is sort of like an extra thing that we don't need to look at. So we want to keep it kind of simple, hence this right here, MA7. So I want you guys to go through this guide, check out some of these things, particularly pertaining to those 5 chords: major 7, minor 7, dominant 7, half diminished 7, and diminished 7th, but you can look at the other chords around it. Before we leave the major family, this gets a little bit confusing because the rules regarding reading chord symbols kind of like changes with different chords. When you have a major 9 chord, this actually indicates some different information, so that X, let's say it's a C, tells us we have a major triad. The MA actually indicates that we have a major 7th. And that number 9 afterwards is indicating that we have the natural 9th on top of our chord, which would be triad, major 7th, with the 9th on top. Now when you see an MA by itself and then any other number, no matter what, if you see MA, you always assume it means major 7th. And the 9 on the side, when you see the number 9, it means we're just going to add that 9th. You might also have something like a major, well, I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and use these as an example down below. Major 13, sharp 11. So how come the 9th, that extension, is not in parentheses, but that sharp 11th is? The parentheses are there to help us kind of clarify some information. So that sharp 11, typically you're going to put, and I guess use the word typically, you're going to put altered extensions. So not natural 9s, C major 9. We're just simply going to put MA, telling us the major 7th, and then the number 9, letting us know, oh, there's also 9th in that chord. This major 13, well, we have C, which is our major triad, major, which is our 7th, and then 13 is telling us there's a 13th in this chord. And it's also telling us there's an altered 11th, which is the sharp 11 here. So here's our triad, MA for the major 7th, 13 for the extension 13, and then the sharp 11. All together, That's that particular sound that we're looking at. So a great way to practice these chords, or just like reading through them, would be to go to a keyboard and, look at X here, just kind of blindly hit a key, and then try and build that using that number system. Our root 3, 5 for our triad, find the major 7th, then grab that 13th, which is also on our chord symbol, and add that sharp 11th. There you go. Let's go ahead and look at some other examples outside of the major family, and this hopefully helps clarify things a little bit. Let's jump right down to the minors, and these are a nice example. So let's look at minor 7, a pretty basic chord type. A common variation is to have -7, which is pretty clear, but generally for our class we want to keep it pretty clean and very, what's the word I'm looking for? Unmistakable. MI meaning minor 7th. Again, we're not going to have to worry about writing MIN, and notice again the quality of the triad is in that sort of like subscript font, and then the actual numbers always go in that sort of superscript font. So anyways, minor 7th. Let's go ahead and use C minor, and by the way, C Mi7, that's like saying a C minor chord or a C minor triad. In fact, if we scroll up, that's how you'd write a C minor triad, just with C minor. So we're going to add that in. And it's always assumed on a minor 7th chord that 7 means something different than Ma7. The 7 here means the lowered 7th. And in fact, for everything except for the major 7th chord, you always assume that the 7 is the lowered 7th. So there's one sort of like discrepancy with chord reading rules right between major and major is the sort of weirdo in the family. So C minor 7 would be, of course, our root, our lowered 3rd, our 5th, and our lowered 7th. Now, let's talk extensions here. When you have a higher number or a higher extension, C minor 11, this is sort of telling you C minor, and then it's telling you the 11th. Okay, there is a bit of an exception to these abbreviated chord symbols. When you have a minor 11, it insinuates that you have not only the, let's get this keyboard shown out here, that you don't have just the triad and the 11th. That's kind of an odd chord right there. Whenever you see a higher number, it insinuates that lower extensions are in the chord as well. So C minor 11, if you see any number above 7, you can assume there's a lowered 7th, always, unless it's a major 7 chord. You can always assume, if we have 11, that the lower extensions or lowered natural extensions, like the 9th, can also be fit into that chord. Or maybe just minor 7 with the 11th. And hear the difference between a minor 7 plain with the 9th, with the 11th. They do have a little bit different quality to them versus and originally that minor 7th chord. So when you see higher numbers, you can always assume lowered 7th and any lower extension. Like in the case of 11, you can always throw a 9 into this chord. If I saw C minor 11, that would be a totally fine chord to like throw down on the keyboard or guitar, whatever. Speaking of alterations, a really common alteration of a minor 7th chord is a minor triad with a major 7th. Notice that the major is in parentheses. So, oops, that's a minor 7th chord. Let's go and add that major 7th, minor triad, with the major 7th. So, very common sort of, chord progression, like My Funny Valentine, for example, is a C minor triad, followed by the minor major 7th, minor 7th, then ending with a minor 6 chord, which is actually just above here. Hearing those different type flavors of minor on the way down. Hear the top voice move. But those are all different sort of flavors of minor. The basic one we want to be acquainted with here is our minor 7th. But again, the major 7th on a minor chord is seen as a sort of altered 7th. And that's why it's showing up in parentheses over here. A quick side note on chord notation as well. if you had a root that wasn't C, like say B flat, B flat, that would just tell you that you have a B flat triad. If you had a B flat 7 chord, dominant chords is where we're going next. That B flat triad, and the 7th, remember, means assumed as a lower 7th. We get a dominant chord. If you had another extension above this, so let's go ahead and just jump right down to the dominant chords. Like say B flat 9. It would look something like this. We've got B flat 9. Now on B flat 9, this can get a little bit confusing because on a dominant chord, a common extension would be the flatted 9th. And that would be written very differently. Notice that my B flat, the flat part here, is about the same sort of proportion to that B. When you have a flat, it's kind of like a smaller number. If you wanted a B flat dominant 7th chord with a flatted 9th, that's when those parentheses would come in really, really handy to make it clear that the B flat, that part of the actual pitch name, has nothing to do with the extension. So here we have our regular B flat 7, and then our B flat 7, flat 9 right there, versus our B flat with a natural 9. Now remember, because this has the number 9, you can assume there's still a 7th in there. So, for example, here would be our B flat 7, just the chord B flat 7. Now if I had a B flat 9, I wouldn't, oops, sorry, that's the 3rd. I don't necessarily have to write the number 7, because if you just see any higher number, you assume there's a lowered 7th. Really, really important. And when you have an altered extension, like that flat 9, for example, that's when you're going to need to notate that it's a B flat 7 chord with an alteration in parentheses, which would look something like that. Okay, so what I would like you guys to do is please go through that chord standardization guide, look through the chord symbols, and you want to, practice building some chords. Just grab different roots and build up and up and up, kind of see and hear what they sound like. But also try and memorize, and I would recommend doing this exercise by hand. Write out, you could even look at a jazz lead sheet or something and try and use the quote-unquote chord standardization guide to write out that chord progression to kind of get used to these chord symbols, because I guarantee probably not all of you have used all of those exact same chord symbols before. So that covers it. If you have questions, just let me know, and I will, of course, put up that chord standardization guide up on Canvas. All right, there we go.